Chelsea have been incredibly active during the summer transfer window, signing the likes of Raheem Sterling, Kalidou Koulibaly, Carney Chukwuemeka and Marc Cucurella for in excess of £150 million, with the club having bid roughly the same amount for Frenkie de Jong and Wesley Fofana, and plenty of reports suggesting that they won't stop there. Even if the Blues only managed to sign Fofana and de Jong, that would still represent the highest spending transfer window in the entire history of the sport, overtaking the £292 million that Real Madrid spent in the summer of 2019. Under Roman Abramovich, Chelsea spent more money on wages, more money on transfer fees, and sustained heavier losses than any other club in the Premier League. That was made possible because Abramovich, the 13th richest Russian oligarch, pumped more than £1.6 billion of his own personal wealth into the club. That gave Chelsea the ability to outspend teams who generated more revenue than them, sack managers like no one else at the elite level, and make mistakes in the transfer market that went largely unpunished. When £72 million signing Kepa Arrizabalaga couldn't catch a cold at a Downing Street Christmas party, Chelsea simply went out and signed Edouard Mendy instead, after wasting more than £200 million in one of the worst transfer windows in the entire history of English football on the likes of Alvaro Morata, Timothy Bakayoko and Danny Drinkwater. Chelsea redeemed themselves by spending almost the same again the following summer. Few other clubs, Liverpool or Arsenal for instance, would have had the luxury of setting British record transfer fees twice by signing Andrei Shevchenko and Fernando Torres for £30.8 and £50 million, just 4.5 years apart, only for the two strikers to score a combined total of 20 goals in 158 Premier League games, whilst Chelsea continued to spend a fortune throughout that period and remained competitive at the highest level. Now Abramovich is gone though, forced to sell the club after the British government froze his assets, and Chelsea are now owned by a consortium led by Todd Boehly, which includes 3 billionaires and a private equity firm. It is likely, therefore, near certain in fact, that Chelsea's new owners have rather different reasons for owning the club than Abramovich did. And with that being the case, it was widely anticipated that Chelsea would be run much more like other European clubs owned by American private equity firms than they were under the Russian. Yet, as I established right at the very beginning of this video, Chelsea are still spending money like Uncle Roman is writing their checks. So, just what on earth is going on? Before Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea in 2003, the club was in a perilous financial position, struggling to repay a £75 million Euro bond, among other loans, that the club had taken out to fund the redevelopment of Stamford Bridge and the surrounding area under the ownership of Ken Bates. Those problems very quickly went away under Abramovich, who utterly transformed the club from top to bottom, pumping money into the club on a scale that was unprecedented within the Premier League and achieving almost immediate success. There will have been Chelsea fans during the introduction to this video, I've no doubt, who will have been dying to point out that, in recent years, Chelsea's revenue has increased, they have generated an enormous amount of money through player sales, and they have become less dependent upon Abramovich's own wealth. It is certainly true to say that the Blues had become less dependent on Abramovich in the last few years than they were when he first arrived. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a whole queue of billionaires who lined up to try and buy the club. But we ought not kid ourselves into believing that Chelsea were anywhere near self-sufficient. Whether you look at the last 5, 10 or 15 years, Chelsea have received by far the most owner financing in the Premier League, and the figure for the entirety of Roman's reign at Stamford Bridge was more than £1.5 billion. That is enough money to totally reshape Bolton Town Centre. Apparently. Oh no, the plans have had to be put on hold. Admittedly, there were probably better comparisons out there. Whilst Abramovich funded Chelsea through loans from a holding company that he also owned based in the British Virgin Islands, unlike a lot of owners, the Glazers, Abramovich didn't charge any interest on those loans. Abramovich received a lot of credit for stating back in March that he would forego the debt that Chelsea owed him when he was selling the club. But it is worth noting that Chelsea was sold for far more money than almost any experts anticipated. Chelsea were valued at £2.4 billion by Forbes, £1.7 billion by KPMG, and between £1.25 to £1.5 billion by Markham Multivariate when Abramovich put the club up for sale. Few people thought that he would actually get anywhere near that amount, given the circumstances of the sale, but the consortium led by Todd Boehly that acquired the club in May ended up paying a fee of £2.5 billion to buy the club, more than double some estimates, in addition to pledging a further £1.75 billion in future investment to give a headline figure of £4.25 billion, making Chelsea the most expensive football club of all time in a deal worth more than 30 times the amount that Abramovich paid in 2003. I don't want to get too bogged down in the identities and backstories of Chelsea's various new owners. As far as I can tell, none of them are particularly interesting, but Todd Boehly is an investor who previously launched an asset management division at Guggenheim Partners. Mark Walter is the founder and CEO of Guggenheim Partners, and Hans-Jörg Wyss is the founder and former president of Sins Holding AG, a multinational medical device manufacturer which was acquired by Johnson & Johnson for $19.7 billion in 2012. As I said, not very interesting. Whether you believe that Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea to gain legitimacy, business, and political contacts in 2003 to become a public figure so that it would be harder for the Kremlin to ever put a hit on him, or because he genuinely loved Chelsea from the bottom of his heart and wanted to see the club succeed, or indeed a combination of any of the above, it is clear that very few owners in world football would have been able to fund a football club to the tune that Abramovich did, and virtually none would have tolerated such enormous consistent losses. Whilst a lot of the really significant losses did come in Roman's early years, Chelsea's 2020-21 accounts reported the second largest losses in the history of the Premier League, £156 million. And it was only 2 years ago that I made this video, during a window in which Chelsea signed Kai Havertz, Timo Werner, Ben Chilwell, Hakim Ziyech and Edouard Mendy for in excess of £200 million. In that video, I talked a lot about Chelsea's most recently published set of financial accounts, their business model, the impact of COVID upon their operations, and whether they were likely to fall foul of any issues relating to financial fair play or profit and sustainability rules. One of the key takeaways was regarding Chelsea's significant reliance on player sales in order to remain on the right side of any financial regulations, far more so than any other Premier League team, having generated a whopping £643 million in sales over the last 10 years. That is, an updated figure for 2022, I should say, rather than the one from 2 years ago. I rarely go all out for you guys in these videos. A lot of Chelsea's lucrative player sales were made possible by the club's outstanding academy system and their process of recruiting an enormous number of young players, farming them out on loan, sometimes for the best part of a decade, before selling the ones who impress enough to increase in value, but not sufficiently for them to make their first team squad, for significant fees. Whether it is the best method in terms of developing the players themselves is a slightly different issue, but it has served Chelsea well, and it has been a very profitable operation over the years. So far this season, however, Timo Werner is the only player Chelsea have sold for a transfer fee, reportedly having rejoined RB Leipzig for a fee of just over £25 million, plus a £7 million loan fee that the club has received for £97.5 million signing Romelu Lukaku. Meanwhile, they lost both Antonio Rudiger and Andreas Christensen on free transfers. There will be further sales still to come. Callum Hudson-Odoi and Malang Sarr seem imminent, but as things stand, this is Chelsea's least lucrative season of sales for the last 10 years. That is significant, as whilst Chelsea look to be on course for the biggest summer of spending in the Premier League, their revenue, £435 million in the most recent set of accounts, whilst certainly significant, is still some way behind Liverpool on £487 million, Manchester United on £494 million, and Manchester City on £570 million. That is because Chelsea's matchday and, particularly, their commercial revenue is dwarfed by the big three. Despite having some of the most expensive season and matchday tickets in the Premier League, a perennial problem for Chelsea has been their inability to expand or relocate from Stamford Bridge. Chelsea's average attendance was just the 10th highest in the Premier League last season, almost identical to Leeds United's, lower than Everton and Aston Villa's, and half of Manchester United's. It is not exactly befitting of a so-called super club. One of the ways in which Chelsea's new owners plan to fix this problem, and one of the ways in which they have been able to earmark so much cash for recruitment so far this summer, has been through an £800 million loan from financial institutions such as JP Morgan and the Bank of America, which is comprised of a £500 million traditional loan and a revolving credit facility worth £300 million, hence that headline figure that has been so widely reported. That borrowing will be used to fund the signing of new players, the redevelopment of Stamford Bridge, and academy spending, at least according to Boehly, who reportedly plans to rebuild every stand at the bridge, which was first opened in 1877, one by one, so as to allow Chelsea to keep playing their home games there whilst the project is completed, as well as bulldozing the hotel behind the shed end, presumably only once they have been given permission to do so and all guests have been safely evacuated. That project alone will cost far more than £500 million, at least one would imagine, based upon similar projects. Of course, Chelsea do generate revenue of their own, but of the 18 years in which Roman Abramovich owned the club, only 5 were profitable. And that was without replacing every stand at the bridge. During that time, there were 11 seasons in which Chelsea lost more than £50 million, whereas there was just one season in which the club's profits exceeded that amount. In short, Chelsea is a football club that loses a lot of money, and if they spend as much, if not more, on recruitment under Boehly than they did under Abramovich, whilst replacing or at least upgrading Stamford Bridge piece by piece, that is unlikely to change anytime soon. Of course, it is perfectly possible that Boehly and his fellow investors are comfortable with sustaining some fairly heavy losses for the duration of their ownership, or at least for their early years, with a view to capital appreciation, and recouping all of their losses and then some when they come to selling the club, banking, in that instance, on Premier League and Champions League revenues in particular continuing to increase. That raises the question of how long, if that is the case, would they be willing to lose money, and how long do they intend to own Chelsea for before selling the club? From a footballing perspective, whatever their intentions, there is significant reliance on Chelsea remaining competitive and continuing to qualify for the Champions League. During Abramovich's 18 years at Chelsea, there were only 2 seasons in which the Blues failed to qualify for the Champions League, and their success in that competition, 2 titles, 3 finals, and 8 seasons in which they made at least the semis or better, has been worth almost €1 billion to the club. That perhaps explains why Chelsea have seemed a little frantic, or at least very active, during the summer transfer window. Last season, just 3 points separated Chelsea and Tottenham, and just 5 separated themselves and Arsenal. That is in a context in which both Tottenham and Arsenal were in the midst of transitional seasons. Tottenham following Antonio Conte's appointment in November, and Arsenal with a young squad that are still learning under Mikel Arteta. Most football fans would agree that both Arsenal and Tottenham are likely to be much stronger propositions this season than last, and that they will, most likely, though of course it cannot be guaranteed, accumulate a good few more points. Chelsea, therefore, whose trajectory is somewhat more ambivalent, have no other option than to go out and improve their squad. There are, if you like, 2 ways in which to interpret Chelsea's transfer business. One is that it has been chaotic, in terms of their interest having been made very public, missing out on several high-profile targets, most of them to Barcelona, and accusations that they have overpaid for players. The other is that they have signed two brilliant proven Premier League players at good ages, a centre-back who everyone has wanted to sign for years, and one of the most talented teenagers in all of England. The truth, and I hate to be a Chelsea centrist on this one, I think lies somewhere between the two. It is pretty evident, I think, that all is not well at Chelsea. Their pre-season campaign was messy, Thomas Tuchel was not particularly discreet in terms of his critique of his players before the season had even begun, and despite nicking a win against Everton in the opening game of the season, it was not the kind of super convincing performance that might have shut some of their critics up. Gary Neville compared Todd Boehly's approach in the transfer market to someone playing Football Manager, presumably as an insult, although if he meant me playing Football Manager, he was just complimenting the American on having very well-defined targets and for being quite so steely in negotiations. In some ways, I can see where he was coming from. The best operators, who do the best business, tend to keep most of their transfer dealings somewhat under wraps, at least until they are very close to being completed. That isn't always possible, but the fact that almost all of Chelsea's business appears to have been played out quite so publicly, I would view as a concern. It is also the case that paying a potential £62 million for someone who is primarily a left-back, when you already have a £45 million left-back, is, well, a bit unusual. Even Manchester City might view that as frivolous allocation of funds in the fullback position. And whilst Cucurella can play as a centre-back, particularly on the left of a back three, he has been signed off the back of a brilliant season at Brighton where 2/3 of his appearances came as either a fullback or wingback. Raheem Sterling, it won't surprise anyone who is remotely familiar with this channel to discover, I think is an excellent signing. One of the most tactically intelligent players in the league, Erling Haaland's arrival obviously convinced Manchester City that they would be less dependent upon their wide players to score goals and more reliant on them to create. Hence why Sterling, whilst he was offered a new deal, wasn't promised that he would be able to start every game. For £47.5 million, not only have Chelsea bought guaranteed goals in the Premier League, they've also bought someone, it is all too easy to forget, who is still only 27 years old. It is quite possible, I think, that the very best of Raheem Sterling is still to come, and if that is the case, then Chelsea have got themselves an absolute bargain. Koulibaly's signing is one that is very easily understood given the departures of Antonio Rudiger and Andreas Christensen this summer, as is Cesar Azpilicueta's contract extension for much the same reason. It's not often mentioned now, but this time last year, off the back of winning the Champions League the previous season and their seismic improvement after Thomas Tuchel came in, a lot of people, though I should stress, not me, and a lot of pundits, were backing Chelsea to win the title. Whilst Liverpool and Man City went on to actually battle it out for that crown, both amassing more than 90 points, Chelsea finished the season on 74 points and only narrowly avoided dropping out of the Champions League places towards the back end of the campaign. The problem for Chelsea last season, aside from Man City and Liverpool just being much better than them, and everyone else, was primarily a lack of goals. Romelu Lukaku's club record return to the club was, let's just say, catastrophic, heralding only 8 Premier League goals, and Timo Werner couldn't even replicate, let alone build upon, his underwhelming debut campaign with just 4 Premier League goals all season. Mason Mount was the club's top scorer in the league with 11 goals, which admittedly was an improvement on the club's top scorer in the league the season before that, Jorginho, with 7 goals, but still wasn't great. Then you had long-term injuries to Ben Chilwell and Reece James, who Chelsea were so reliant on in those wing-back positions, and the likes of N'Golo Kante and Christian Pulisic also suffered from lengthy setbacks and were never able to find their best form even when fit. Chelsea's transfer business, whilst it may seem chaotic, is an attempt to rectify those problems. And even the signing of Cucurella, which has probably been the most externally criticised move, can be viewed through that lens. In terms of Ben Chilwell rupturing his cruciate ligament last season, 2 centre-backs having departed, and Marcos Alonso rumoured to be on his way out of the club as well. The issue for Chelsea, or one issue at least, is that they are not done yet. And if you look, for instance, at their once again very public interest in Wesley Fofana, I don't doubt that the fee that the club paid for Cucurella has convinced Leicester City that they can demand an even higher fee for the Frenchman than they might previously have done. Clearly, Leicester don't want to sell Fofana at all, but their supposed asking price of £85 million, which would be a world record fee for a defender, I think is perfectly reasonable if Chelsea are happy to concede, as they have done, that Cucurella is worth over £60 million, especially given the fact that Fofana still has 5 years left on his deal in Leicestershire. Frenkie de Jong, another of the club's most strongly publicised transfer targets, is obviously at the centre of a pretty bizarre set of circumstances right now, but Barcelona will still want an enormous fee if they are ever to sanction a sale, reportedly in excess of £70 million. And if it is to be believed that Chelsea also want to sign Wilfried Zaha, we will be talking about another crazy fee, particularly for a 29-year-old. In terms of financial fair play and profit and sustainability rules, just as I said on this channel 2 years ago, Chelsea should be fine, for the time being at least. It has been reported that Chelsea's spending has been more than Boehly initially budgeted for in his first summer in charge though, and with that figure perhaps going to double before the window slams shut, that could mean much quieter and more modest windows for Chelsea in the future, and potential pitfalls if their new arrivals don't work out. There is no reason to believe that, without Abramovich, Chelsea won't be able to spend a fortune on players. We have already seen that isn't the case. But it may well be the case that Chelsea can no longer afford to make too many £97.5 million mistakes in the transfer market and just move on without feeling any long-term consequences. One area where Chelsea haven't yet strengthened is in terms of a replacement for Romelu Lukaku, which you might think would be an even more urgent priority in light of Timo Werner's sale. In terms of striking options, Chelsea now only really have Armando Broja, who may well stick around given Chelsea's lack of depth up front, despite interest from Everton, Newcastle and Southampton, and Kai Havertz, who obviously isn't an out-and-out centre-forward, but has led Chelsea's line on multiple occasions. Unless, of course, you think that Michy Batshuayi is going to hang around this summer. That still wasn't enough to convince Chelsea to go in for Cristiano Ronaldo, despite his very well-documented eagerness to leave Manchester United. And the Blues have been linked with everyone from Benjamin Sesko and Memphis Depay to Jamie Vardy and Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang. And whilst I've no doubt that most, if not all of those names are absolute nonsense, I would be shocked if they weren't in the market for a centre-forward, especially when you look at Gabriel Jesus at Arsenal, Darwin Núñez at Liverpool, Harry Kane at Tottenham, and Erling Haaland at Manchester City, the 4 teams who are likely to be Chelsea's closest competitors this season. I don't make prediction videos on this channel, other than for the World Cup and the Euros, but if I did, I'd find Chelsea a really tricky team to try and judge this season. On paper, I think you could make a decent case that they are still the 3rd strongest team in the division. But there is just a good feeling around Tottenham and Arsenal right now, and whilst theoretically that could be cut short at any moment, it would worry me if I was a Chelsea fan. Longer term, it remains to be seen what Boehly's strategy will be. I must admit, I have been surprised by the level of investment in players this summer, and even more so the likely total by the end of the window. Whether that will be sustained, it is quite hard to see how it could be unless Chelsea become even more profitable in terms of player sales. There are, it should be said, 8 Chelsea players reportedly available for sale this summer, on top of the already departed Werner, and whilst the likes of Kennedy and Ross Barkley are unlikely to command enormous transfer fees if they depart on permanent deals, Callum Hudson-Odoi could, albeit perhaps not as much as Bayern Munich were bidding a few years ago. Meanwhile, Malang Sarr is off to Monaco on loan, with a £10 to £13 million obligation to buy at the end of the season, and all will clear a considerable amount of the club's wage bill. In terms of the TLDR then, what is going on? Chelsea are spending heavily because Champions League status and Champions League revenue is vital to the club's future prospects and profitability, and Chelsea and Arsenal's improvement necessitates that they take drastic action. Have they completely lost their minds? Probably not, even if Marc Cucurella's price tag, with Ben Chilwell still at the club, might seem a tad overpriced, and it will be mildly infuriating to watch if Chelsea do fork out £35 million on Denzel Dumfries, having sold Tariq Lamptey and Tino Livramento since 2020, two of the best young attacking fullbacks, not just in the Premier League, but arguably in all of Europe. Ultimately, it will probably take 2 or 3 years before we know fully both what Todd Boehly and his consortium's intentions are, how competent they are, and how capable the administrators that they have appointed are as well. So that is it for today's video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.